On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany. Paris had fallen. The army was in ruins. The government had run to Bordeaux and then to Vichy. Two-thirds of the country was about to be occupied. And that same week, deep in the hills of Alsace, a French artillery officer named Colonel Schwartz sat inside a concrete fortress called Fort Schoenenburg, 6 stories underground, and fired his 135mm guns at German infantry moving through the Rhine Valley. He was winning. He would keep winning for another 5 days. When the order finally came from his own defeated government to lay down his arms, his soldiers reportedly wept. Fort Schoenenburg had never been taken. Neither had almost any of its sisters. This is the autopsy of the Maginot Line, the fortress that did exactly what it was built to do and lost anyway. To understand why, you have to start in the trenches of 1918. France won the First World War. It also buried 1.5 million young men. 27% of its soldiers under 30 were dead, and hundreds of thousands more had come home without legs, without eyes, without lungs. The birth rate had collapsed during the war years, so France knew, with the certainty of a demographer's spreadsheet, that from 1935 onward, its annual class of 18-year-old conscripts would be roughly half the German one. There were simply not going to be enough Frenchmen. A war fought the way 1914 had been fought would empty the country. 2 conclusions flowed from this arithmetic. First, never again would France bleed a generation in mass frontal attacks. Second, the next war had to be won with concrete, with steel, and with firepower rather than with men. In 1929, the National Assembly voted 274 million francs of initial funding for a permanent fortified line along the German border. It was named for the war minister who fought hardest for it, a Verdun veteran who walked with a cane for the rest of his life. His name was André Maginot. What they built between 1930 and 1940 was not a wall. It was a system. Along roughly 700 kilometers of the northeastern frontier, French engineers sank 58 major fortresses called ouvrages into the hills. The largest of them, Hackenberg, ran for 10 kilometers of underground galleries and housed a garrison of 1,000 men. Between the big forts sat smaller ones, blockhouses, casemates, anti-tank ditches, mined barriers, and electrified wire. On the surface, a visitor saw a mound of grass, a couple of low steel domes, a mushroom-shaped turret. Everything else was underground. 6 to 8 stories down, connected by electric railways, air-filtered against gas attack, ran barracks, hospitals, kitchens, magazines, and generator halls. Retractable turrets rose out of concrete to fire and then sank back to reload behind 2 meters of armor. On paper, and at the demonstrations French generals proudly hosted for foreign attachés through the 1930s, the Maginot Line was the most sophisticated defensive system on Earth. The final bill came to somewhere around 3 billion francs. Every centime of it, the general said, would save French lives. And here is the detail that every angry critic of the Maginot Line misses. It was never designed to defend the entire border. It ran along Germany. It did not run along Belgium. The reason was partly political. Belgium was an ally and did not want to be written off as a battlefield, and partly geographic, since much of the Franco-Belgian border is flat, wet, industrial land where deep underground works are impossible. But the deeper reason was strategy. The French plan for the next war was not to sit and wait. The plan, called Dyle-Breda, was to use the Maginot Line to freeze the German army along the direct route, force any invasion to swing northwest through Belgium the way it had in 1914, and then race the best divisions of the French army, along with the British Expeditionary Force, forward into Belgium to meet that swing on the Dyle River. The line was not a shield, it was a funnel. It was designed to make the enemy do exactly one predictable thing, so France could concentrate its mobile forces to defeat him doing it. And on May 10, 1940, that is precisely what happened. Sort of. Because the German plan for 1940 had gone through a violent revision. The original scheme, Fall Gelb, was a slightly modified 1914, a heavy right hook through the Low Countries. In February, a 52-year-old staff officer named Erich von Manstein persuaded Hitler to try something else. Send the diversionary force through Holland and Belgium as expected, but hide the Schwerpunkt, the real weight of the offensive, 7 panzer divisions under Guderian, Reinhardt, and Hoth, in the one place the French said armor could not go, the Ardennes forest. The Ardennes was steep, densely wooded, threaded with narrow winding roads, and defended by second-rate French reserve divisions because Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, had personally described it as impenetrable to modern armor. Manstein bet that 134,000 German soldiers and 41,000 vehicles could push through it in 3 days. On May 10th, they started trying. On May 13th, the lead panzers of Guderian's 19th Corps reached the Meuse River at Sedan. On May 14th, they were across it. On May 20th, 10 days after the war began, they hit the English Channel at Abbeville and cut the Allied armies in half. While this was happening, notice where the Maginot Line was. It was to the south, exactly where it had been built, exactly holding the sector it had been built to hold, exactly not being attacked in force. The Germans did not smash it because they did not have to. The line had, in the narrow sense, worked. It had made a full frontal assault so unattractive that the German High Command spent months designing a way around it. The trouble was that the way around it did not require the polite loop through central Belgium the French had war-gamed. It required a knife thrust through the Ardennes the French had ruled out. The line had funneled the enemy, and the enemy had gone through the wall of the funnel. And the mobile armies that were supposed to counterattack that thrust were up in Belgium chasing the diversion exactly as planned. Now watch what the line itself did during the collapse. Beginning on June 14th, once the outcome of the campaign was already settled in the north, the Germans finally turned to reduce the Maginot forts they had been avoiding. They called it Operation Tiger, and they threw 88mm anti-aircraft guns, siege mortars, Stukas, and infantry assault teams at fortress after fortress. Fort Schoenenburg took over 160 direct hits from German heavy artillery, including 420mm siege shells fired from the same class of gun that had smashed the Belgian forts in 1914. Its concrete cracked in places. Its turrets kept firing. Fort Hackenberg's cannons drove off every ground assault. Fort Fermont held. Fort Michaelsburg held. Fort Simserhof held. Of the 58 major ouvrages, only 2 were captured by direct assault before the ceasefire, and both after ferocious close-quarters fighting. Between them, the Maginot garrisons killed and wounded more Germans in those final weeks than they lost themselves. When Marshal Pétain went on the radio on June 17th to tell the French to stop fighting, the men inside the forts thought at first that it must be a German trick. Their instrument panels showed working guns, full magazines, undamaged crews. They refused to open their armored doors. It took until early July, after direct written orders came down through their own chain of command, before the last commandant of Fort Schoenenburg finally led his men out into the sunlight. German officers, unusually, allowed them to march out with rifles shouldered and colors flying. Some Germans saluted. It was the least awkward part of an extremely awkward surrender. So what is the finding? The Maginot Line was not a folly. It was not a symbol of French cowardice. It was a technically brilliant answer to the question its designers were asked, and it delivered on that answer. It saved probably tens of thousands of French lives on the sector it covered. It shaped the German invasion route as intended. Its garrisons fought harder and lasted longer than almost any other component of the French war effort. If the Maginot Line had been the whole plan, it would have worked. The trouble is that a fortress line is only ever one piece of a plan, and the rest of the French plan was 3 separate failures stacked on top of each other. First, an intelligence failure that dismissed the Ardennes route despite explicit reports of German armor massing on its far side. Second, a doctrinal failure that treated tanks as infantry support rather than a decisive maneuver arm, so that when Guderian broke through at Sedan, the French counterattacks arrived piecemeal, days late, without radios, and were destroyed in detail. Third, a command failure. Gamelin, from his headquarters at the Château de Vincennes, ran the campaign without a single radio, communicating with the front by motorcycle courier. The German Panzer Corps advanced faster than his orders could travel. The Maginot Line is remembered as the answer to the wrong question. That framing is too generous to the men who wrote the question. They knew, or should have known, that fortifications were a tactical instrument, not a strategy. What they did was pour their nation's scarcest resources, money, engineering talent, and above all, political will, into the one part of the problem that felt controllable and let the harder parts atrophy. The line was an emotional relief as much as a military plan. It let France believe that the trauma of 1918 could be walled off. That is the deeper lesson of the autopsy. A fortress is a physical object, but it is also a psychological choice. It says, "This is the war I want to fight, and I am going to make the enemy fight it too." The Germans in May 1940 declined that invitation. Cause of death: the wrong war, brilliantly prepared for. If you want more autopsies of history's worst military decisions, subscribe to Battle Autopsy. Next on the table, the amphibious assault that succeeded by failing on purpose. Thanks for watching.